Temos aqui o privilégio de ter uma segunda palestra do professor Peter Boettke, que é professor de Economia e Filosofia da George Mason, Universidade George Mason, autor de vários livros, o mais recente, Living Economics, Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow. O tema da palestra de hoje, da segunda palestra, do professor Boettke, é Contra a Triagem na Economia, Desventuras no Pronto Socorro Econômico. Eu queria pedir uma salva de palmas para o professor Peter Boettke.
There we go. Okay, thank you again. It's great here. I have the unenviable task of talking before Ron Paul talks, so many of you are, I'm sure, excited to get to that. And also following the last speaker, who I don't speak Portuguese, but I sat in the back room watching it on TV, and just a natural, so keep speaking. So very good. And it's very important to have people that are articulate and communicate these ideas in such a natural way to keep the sort of spread of these ideas going in the young. This is Against Triage Economics, Misadventures in Economic Emergency Rooms. It's a book that I'm working on at the moment. I've decided to take all the statistics out as I go through here, because I was speaking to students. So I'm going to be painting with a kind of a broad brush. So those who are my professional colleagues, I apologize in the front about this. And it's U.S.-centric. As opposed to world, so it's really focused on the policy responses in the United States after 2008. And the title is Against Triage Economics, that it's really against emergency room economics. That triage is a medical term that's done when you're in like the military or in an emergency situation. Imagine an earthquake hits, and then all of a sudden you go into the hospital and you do triage medicine. And I'm sort of arguing that that's like the worst place to find good medicine, all right? And especially when it comes to economics. And let me like pursue this metaphor a little bit. Larry Summers, who's a very, very bright man, but also very confident in himself. He recently defended, economists in the financial crisis by saying, look, economists are doctors to the world. When the world is sick, we're going to go where the illness is. And macroeconomics is our medicine, and we're going to cure the world, okay? And so macro policy is the medicine, monetary policy, fiscal policy are going to be the cures to the ills of unemployment and economic instability. Now, so Summers is using the metaphor. This metaphor of doctors to the world was actually used by the first American Keynesian economist, Laurie Torchius, who wrote the first textbook. And he actually said the reason why he converted himself to Keynesianism was because it allowed him to be a doctor to the world. All right, and so now for those of you who have been a little bit knowledgeable about Hayek's position, Hayek is, in contrary to that, argued that the economist should be a humble, actor and should not claim to be a constructivist. In Hayek's own Nobel Prize address, which is called The Pretense to Knowledge, he indicts the economics profession for, in fact, having this position. Let me just read Hayek's own Modern Technology. So I pulled it up, and now I have the quote, which I don't have in my talk. It's always bad when you add quotes at the last minute. If man is not to do more harm than good in his efforts to improve the social order, he will have to learn that in this, as in all other fields where essential complexity of an organization prevails, he cannot acquire the full knowledge which would make mastery of the events possible. He will therefore have to use what knowledge he can achieve not to shape the results as the craftsman shapes his handiwork, but rather to cultivate a growth by providing the appropriate environment in the manner in which a gardener does this for his plants. Okay, this is Hayek's position. So the economist is not to be a social engineer, but to be a good gardener. this metaphor you should keep in your heads because it's going to come back again and again through this talk. Anyway, if we go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up what the term triage means, it's about the assignment of the degrees of urgency in dealing with patients and how you line them up. You can black toe a patient, which means there's no hope for them and then they're dead. Or what you can do is figure out. And this is what the kind of emergency room economists do. Should we engage in monetary policy? Should we engage in fiscal policy in order to save the patient, which is the ailing economy? And this whole talk is against that sort of approach. So here's George W. Bush, okay? I should point out, by the way, George Bush is not really a free market president. The very first act that he engaged in when he was elected was to provide subsidies to the steel industry. And the last act he did was to nationalize our banking industry, basically. So he kind of stinks as a president for a variety of reasons. But a lot of people on the left view him as kind of a right-wing economist or, a kind of a free market guy. And this quote is from December, and he says, well, I have obviously made the decision to make sure that the economy doesn't collapse. I've abandoned the free market principles to save the free market system. Okay? You can read that quote, by the way, from every president from Roosevelt forward in some form or other. He's just the latest manifestation of this quote. I have to abandon the free market in order to save the free market. I have to abandon capitalism to save capitalism, that kind of idea. All right? I should point out, by the way, it's businessmen are not immune to these kind of things either, right? I want to have fair and free competition for everyone except for my industry, right, where I want protection. Joseph Schumpeter, the great historian of thought, used to make a joke. He'd say every time he would talk to American capitalists, he had to run back home and read The Wealth of Nations to reaffirm his faith in capitalism. And here's the answer to this. Henry Hazlitt. All right? And for the young people out there, as you're just starting off in economics, there still remains no better book to be your first book to study economics than Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So Bastiat and Hazlitt, that's where you should start and even if you think of yourself as advanced, it's good to go back and read those books again. But Hazlitt, this is in Economics in One Lesson. He says, look, emotional economics has given birth to theories that calm examination cannot justify. So the worst place that we can find our economic theories being evolved and generated is in the cauldron of a crisis, because that's all about emotional economics, not cool-headed economics. And what we want to have cool-headed economics. We want to keep our head in the midst of a crisis, not lose our heads in the midst of a crisis. So the alternative title for my book, I always have battles with people on my titles in my books because I give the boring academic titles. A treatise on blah, 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 blah. And, not my best friend, but my really, really good friend from college, Matt Kibbe, he has a bestseller out right now. It's called Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. So my wife and we know Matt and Terry all the way back from when we were at college, and Matt was a good friend of mine in college. And Rosemary, my wife, saw the book and she's like smacked me and said, why don't you think of titles like that? People can, everyone can understand that. They have no idea what the hell you're saying, So she doesn't like the triage title. So the alternative is Don't Panic. I don't like that because then I'll annoy my academic colleagues. So I have to come up with some name that no one else understands and sell only 3 copies of the book or whatever. My wife, by the way, was the one who came up with Living Economics. My title was the subtitle, Economics for Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And my wife's comment was, I'm going to fall asleep. She goes, why the hell do you pick these titles? Anyway. All right. But Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. Emotional economics has given birth to theories that calm examination cannot justify. The economics of illusion, that is Keynesian economics. That's a term that comes from a good colleague of Mises and Hayek and Hazlitt named Albert Hahn, who was a proto-Keynesian economist who then got converted to the monetary theory of the trade cycle. and then wrote about what the consequences of Keynesianism is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today, but what he points here is that it's economics of illusion. So, take the talk, so I can't follow Portuguese, but I can follow enough about what you were talking about. In some sense, what you have when you had the picture from The Economist of the Brazilian economy taking off, and then the Brazilian economy failing or whatever, what generates all of that is actually loose monetary policy, right? Policies that direct the allocations into these ideas. During that boom phase, it's not really a boom. It's not really long-term economic growth that's being generated. It's actually a short-term inflating of a bubble. That's illusion, okay? And to a large extent, the economies in Europe and the United States have been in the era of economics illusion since World War II. So what people call the Great Moderation actually really isn't the Great Moderation. It's an artificial economy. We didn't get into the problems that we're in today under the Bush administration or under Obama. You have to go back much further to see where all of this started to go awry. So here's my main points. Simple economics is not simple-minded. Your economics professors will tell you all the time, oh, that's simple-minded economics. It's not really simple-minded. It's actually simple, basic economics. This ain't rocket science. Demand curve slope downward. We live in a world of scarcity. We face trade-offs. The persistent and consistent application of the economic way of thinking is hard work. But the basic insights of economics are applied common sense. And you have to continually go back to those first principles. Even in the most extraordinary of times, what is most needed is ordinary economics. In fact, you could make an argument that in the crisis moment, what we need more than anything else is basic economics, not some new exotic economics. We must never buy into the message that it's okay to sacrifice our long-term economic growth for short-term economic relief. Okay? This is what gets us into the whole trouble with the bias against deflation, which is that if we believe deflation generates the debt deflation crisis, every tick down in deflation, or the prices going down, is going to be interpreted as deflation, and therefore we're going to bias the system against any tick down in prices, and then we get permanent inflation. But the reality is that some deflations are actually really good. I don't know how many can see this, but this is my cell phone. This cell phone, it's an Apple, okay, has more computing power than the first computer that I owned. Okay? The price of a cell phone back in 1980 was only for the wealthiest people in the world. Okay? So if you go back and watch Dallas reruns, you'll see Victoria Principal, right, with her cell phone. She's the only one who can have a cell phone, and it's the size of her head and her body, and she's going around. That's why she gets in the car accident, which is the beginning of the concern about cell phones and cars, right? It's the Dallas show, and it costs like $1 gazillion. Now students have these, and they have better ones than me. All right, this is the old version of the cell phone. That price of that cell phone, a real price of that, has fallen. Is that deflation, or is it just improvements in technology? That's improvements in technology. So that's a difference between, but yet if I'm biased the system, I start seeing these prices tick down. I say, oh my God, the economy's going into a tailspin. I need to reinflate the bubble. That, by the way, is the Greenspan era in the United States. It's what now we call the Greenspan put. Every time Greenspan saw a tick down, what he did was refuel the economy with more expansion in the money supply. This is one of the reasons why Ron Paul, he's not going to be talking about that tonight, I don't think, but his point about the Fed and why he was so important when he was on that committee is precisely because he's challenging that kind of approach to monetary policy. The idea that you continually refuel the economy by, as my professor used to say, priming the pump, right? Senholz was my teacher. So you must not buy into that. And finally, we need to have politics by principle and not due to either panic nor interest groups. So what I want to point out is that there's nothing new in what I'm saying or what Mises says or what Hayek says that you don't find in Adam Smith when it comes to these kind of public policy questions. Adam Smith pointed out long ago that governments want to do the following thing. They want to run deficits. That accumulates into a public debt. Then they want to monetize the public debt to pay it back with cheaper currency. So they want to monetize, inflate. So you engage in deficits, debt, and debasement. And that this is the practice. And as you can read here from this, okay, I'm not going to read this out to you because I already read the Hayek quote and I don't want to do that again. But if you read here carefully, what he does, he goes through this about the single instance. He says, look, I don't know a single instance where they've actually paid it back. They're always going to do this. And as you say, there's almost all states, as well as modern, ancient as well as modern, have played this very juggling trick. He refers to it as a juggling trick. So in Adam Smith's wisdom, what he's trying to get us to do is recognize that governments want to juggle. So what do you do with jugglers that you don't want juggling? You either tie their hands so they can't juggle, or you take the balls or clubs out of their hands so they can't juggle. So when Hayek writes Denationalization of Money, which I think is available in Portuguese, is that correct? It is, right? You should go and read that. When Hayek writes Denationalization of Money, what he's trying to do is cut the juggling by taking money out of the hands of the state, right? So that's one of his reasons for that radical conclusion, which, by the way, he comes to out of frustration because he tries throughout his whole career to tie the hands of the government, but he's unable to do it. So then eventually he says, we got to pull it. Milton Friedman, by the way, had the same frustration, right? Many of you know that Milton Friedman went through in his monetarist phase, you know, the K% rule, right? The government was supposed to target the money supply to the output in the economy. And then he said, oh, we can't rely on humans to do it, so let's put it on a computer. You know, at the end of his life, he actually argued for taking it out of the hands of the state as well, all right? And he became somewhat sympathetic to arguments for free banking. Friedman in Capitalism and Freedom, in a passage which is very often forgotten by his close compatriots, he says, any institution where a sincere error by a few could threaten the existence of the economy is perhaps an institution we can't afford. It's around page 58 of Capitalism and Freedom. Any institution that a sincere error by a few can threaten the existence of the economy is an institution that we can't afford. What was that institution? Central banking, even in Friedman's story, right? So Adam Smith recognizes it. You know, Hayek, Mises, this is a juggling trick. You're supposed to say boo hiss. The legacy of Lord Keynes. So all of these economists, from Adam Smith all the way up to F.A. Hayek, are making an argument that we should concern ourselves with stopping the juggling. Keynes comes along and convinces the economics profession that our goal is to be master jugglers. That's the job. And then the problem is that he, by teaching this technique called macroeconomics, now I'm going to threaten my legitimacy with my colleagues because there is no such thing as a science of macroeconomics. It's a bunch of made-up stuff. There's only microeconomics, that's economics, okay? There may be macroeconomic phenomena, unemployment, inflation, business fluctuations, but there's only microeconomic explanations and solutions. By the way, for all you students, write that down and bring it up in class and see your professor's head blow up. Unless they were trained at Chicago or someplace decent. But if they're at Harvard, MIT, they're going to be like, you know, like that. So microeconomics is economics. It's all about relative prices. Prices guide production. Think about Hayek's title of his book, Prices and Production. It's because prices guide production. All right? I'm not saying I'm Hayek, but that's the reason why my title of my book is Calculation and Coordination. Again, one of those titles that my wife hates. But it's because of calculation, the ability to engage in economic calculation, that we're able to achieve advanced economic coordination. That was the point. But so the legacy, so on the flanking of Keynes, I have Hayek's Tiger by the Tail, which is about the inflation. The subtitles of these books are the inflationary legacy of Keynes, right? The Keynesian legacy of inflation. And then this is Democracy and Deficit by Jim Buchanan. So we have two Nobel Prize winners, 74 and 86. And what Buchanan's arguing here is Democracy and Deficit, which is the deficits that are the legacy of Keynes, permanent deficits. So despite Keynes teaching us about juggling, our post-Keynes ascendancy world is one that's characterized by inflations and debt problems. So that's what Keynes brought us, a legacy of deficits, debt, and debasement, not prudent macroeconomic management. So these master jugglers are, in fact, social engineers. That's what macroeconomic management of the economy, or aggregate demand management of the economy is. All right, and you're trained to do that. How many here, the students here, have had principles of macroeconomics? Come on, raise your hand. So in very first class of principles of macroeconomics, you learn a Keynesian cross, okay, in which you have a 45-degree line, an aggregate demand curve. Then you have an unemployment equilibrium, and you have a full employment equilibrium. You're stuck in the unemployment equilibrium, and you work the world through the multiplier to be able to get us to the full employment level of output. That's the simplest model, supposedly rejected by macroeconomists all the way back to Hicks and the ISLM framework, income expenditures. In the middle of the financial crisis, Paul Krugman wrote an article in the New York Times, and he said, this is the macro policy of the world that we live in. And what he did was he drew the Keynesian cross, the simplest model. And if you think about it, again, think about what TARP was supposed to do. TARP is exactly the Keynesian idea. Do not worry about what you're doing with the government investment. It doesn't matter if you're building potholes. Make the potholes, fill it in. That's going to get the pump priming. And we're going to use the fiscal policy to do that. This is the master jugglers. Bernanke's a master juggler. Yellen's a master juggler. Paulson, all of these guys are trained in these techniques. To the Austrian economists or the classical liberal political economists, the point is that this gives too much discretionary control to the government officials. Friedman argued against this in terms of the long and variable lag, right? That was his criticism. All right, Buchanan argued for a variety of reasons about what the bias in the system was that led to deficits. Hayek argued what the bias in the system that's going to lead to inflation. In all of these sort of approaches, the broad brush classical liberal approach to this, it warns against discretionary control being handed to a few men. So what's some unpleasant logic of these master jugglers? Remember Adam Smith's point, and remember his point empirically, that no one ever honestly pays out their debts. What Friedman says is that what Smith says is that in our position of, what did I do here? Uh-oh. Kicked over some water. If I get electrocuted here, give a scholarship in my name or something. All right. All right, so sorry about that. So in what Smith says, trying to recapture my thought here and not kill myself. What Smith says is that what's least harmful to creditors and what's least dishonorable to the debtors would be to have an avowed bankruptcy. In modern terms, we would say that's a repudiation by the government of its debts. It would come along and just say, look, I'm repudiating the debts. Now, why do we always argue that governments can't do the repudiation? Was because they would threaten their legitimacy with their creditors, right? And we say, oh, so we can't have them repudiate because then that would do. That's in fact Smith's point. Admit you can't make your payments, so stop doing the illusion and admit that you can't do it, and then have yourself constrained, right? So where does this go awry? Okay, first thing, functional finance. Functional finance was a term developed by an economist named Abel Lerner. And it was to use the idea of the basic idea was don't worry about balancing the budget, worry about using the budget to balance the economy. Okay? So before functional finance, economists were concerned anytime that you ran deficits, that what you should do is pay those deficits back as soon as the crisis was over. So if you ran a deficit because you're fighting a war, or if you ran a deficit because of economic emergency, your goal as soon as that emergency is over is to pay the debt back as fast as possible. Okay? So that was the functional finance idea. But what Buchanan came along and said is, okay, we're going to introduce functional finance within democracies. What actually are the working assumptions in a democracy? Right? So politicians want to do what? They're by definition vote-seeking entrepreneurs. All right? And they have to get votes and campaign contributions from the citizens. So citizens are the demanders of politician services. Politicians are the suppliers. And what you're going to do when you're trying to get elected is you want to maximize your votes and your campaign contributions. So what are you going to do? You're going to promise spending behavior to your constituencies that will vote for you. And so you end up by having a bias in the political system to concentrate benefits on the well-organized, well-informed, and disperse the costs on the unorganized and ill-informed massive voters. The other thing you're going to do is you're going to do that in a short-sightedness fashion. You're going to concentrate benefits today at the expense of tomorrow. Why? What's the least organized and least informed interest group? People that aren't born yet. So if I build a big project today and then make the people 25 years from now pay for it, they have no say in why it is that that's not going to happen, right? And so Buchanan says, look, functional finance is okay over the life of the business cycle. That makes sense, but the problem is that in democracies there's no incentive for politicians to run there's surpluses in the times of plenty. There's lots of incentives for them to run deficits in the times of crisis, but no effort or acknowledgement for them to run surpluses in times of plenty. So as a result, what you're going to get is permanent deficits, which then accumulate into public debts. I already mentioned before about this deflation and the costs of inflation. Here's the bottom line. It's very simple again. Goods buy money and money buys goods. In a modern economy, goods don't buy goods. So money is one half of all exchanges in the economy. So get ready for the complicated economic insight. If you screw around with money, you screw around with all the exchanges in the economy. Don't get nervous. That's a very simple point, but it's actually what it means to have non-neutral money. Meaning that money is a link to all exchanges in the economy. So if I distort the money unit, I distort all the exchanges in the economy. So by us biasing the system against deflation, we commit ourselves to permanent inflation. Those permanent inflations are not just adjustments of the prices, right? It's not just the adjustment of what we call menu costs or shoe leather costs, all right? It's actually that adjustment takes time. And as a result, the exchanges that are affected by the non-neutral money are going to lead to malinvestments. And that's going to generate discoordination in your economy, which means you're going to have real losses. Business cycles are going to be generated by that. With those business cycles are tied to people various different employment and investment decisions, in particular the allocation of talent. So talented people get attracted to various different activities, which in a market they wouldn't be attracted to if there was a market, but since the government is now expending resources, they get drawn to that. That's part of the Friedman argument against crowding out, or Friedman argument about crowding out. All right? There's one way to think about crowding out, which is that public investment crowds out private investment because private investment is interest sensitive, government investment is not. But it's also the case that if government becomes the main investor, talented people that otherwise would be in the private sector allocate their resources over to the public sector. And so you have a misallocation not only of capital but of talent that when the bad investment reveals itself has to be reallocated and reshuffled. Or another way to think about it is recalculated, right? You have to recalculate labor, you have to recalculate capital, and you have to recalculate these investment decisions. And manipulating money and credit distorts that recalculation process. It's one of the reasons why, when the investments turn out to be wrong investments and we adjust, why it's so costly in the adjustment period. Right? There's no symmetry, by the way, between the boom and the bust. So a boom can be a slight, and then the bust has to be severe, or the boom can be big and the bust it depends on other factors, what's going on with technology at the time and whatnot. But there's no claim to symmetry in the Austrian cycle theory. All there is this distortions that need to be recalculated. And those recalculations are costly. And so we have to keep that in mind when we think about what kind of policy. Here's the United States government. Okay? Promissory politics means this issue of putting a chicken in every pot. Right? This has been our notion, right? Obama ran in 2008 on the following thing: hope and change, not more of the same. What the hell did that mean? No one really knows. Hope and change. But that was a big promise to everyone, right? And so it means 1,000 and different promises to everyone. It's a more vague way of saying I'm going to give a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, right? Kind of thing when you're running. It's populist politics gone amok. And that's America. Well, what does that populist politics generates to? It generates to promises that we oblige government to engage in. So we're going to say, oh, okay, look, we're going to pay for your retirement. So what's wrong with the United States at the moment? Good things, by the way. We're retiring younger, we're living longer, and we expect to live during that retirement just as well off as we did when we worked. That's a pretty good deal, right? So it used to be the case that, basically you retired at 68 and you died at 70. At that point, you're not really eating up much of the Social Security benefits, right? It's like you're a good deal for the younger generation. But now what's happened is it's a Christmas tree, okay? It used to be the case that the Christmas tree looked like this, and now it's looked like this, meaning that the population growth underneath is much lower than the population that needs to be sustained. And the advances have, in fact, improved, so the baby boomers are going to live to be 90, and there's not that many kids coming up, so that means the share that they have to pay to do this is, again, it's not rocket science, okay? This is really applied common sense and demographics. So the United States government plays tricks, by the way, with the numbers. I was just looking at some numbers before I came in here. I promised you I wouldn't do big statistics, but I want you to do something, for those of you who are really interested in this. Look at what the CPI would say if it was calculated the way it was in 1980, and then look at what the CPI would say today if it was calculated as it was in 1990. So what we try to do, all right, it was over 10% if it's 1980, around 8% if it's 1990 calculations. We've recalculated under Boettke, right? We recalculated the way that we do CPI so that we suppress inflation in your calculations. So we can run around and say we're not going to have the misery index anymore, right? That's what Ronald Reagan ran on in 1979, right? Was double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, the misery index. That's what Jimmy Carter gave us. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And then Reagan said in 1984, that's what he ran on. He just said, are you better off? People said, yes, Ronnie. And they voted for him. Whereas under Jimmy Carter, they said, no, Jimmy. And so Jimmy Carter ended up by not being a president. He became a statesman running around fixing houses and stuff. So if you ask the government what our debt is, they tell you it's around $12 trillion. But if you actually calculate the promises that we've made, all right, and the obligations the government has committed itself to the citizens, our debt is actually $205 to $211 trillion. Which means that the United States isn't broke 40 years ago, it's broke today. Okay? It's a broke country right today, just like Greece or something. All right? The problem is that we're the biggest bear on the block, right? So as a result, I'll come back to this in the end, but if you're having a fight and a bear's trying to catch you and you're running with your friend who happens to be like rotund and you're like a quick, swift one, you don't really have to worry about it, right? Because the bear's going to eat the fat one. All right? And that's other economies. The United States, like the swifter one, right? And the United States actually right now, you could postulate, has a broken leg, but they're really good with the crutch. And the fat guy can't run at all. So he's just like gets eaten. And you're like, good, and you keep moving. But so this is an interesting sort of picture. The person to read on this is Lawrence Kontlikov, who is a professor at the Boston University. And he's done the most work on what's called intergenerational accounting, trying to count the beans of how much money is owed to Americans, what's the ability of Americans to pay for that amount of money. And the shocking thing that Kontlikov tells us is that in order for the U.S. to currently meet its obligations with no increase in those obligations, by the way, just imagine what that's like. no increasing in the promises that politicians are making. So from now on, they're not going to make any new promises. That's not going to happen, right? But what he says, in order to do that, and with our current population, we would have to cut government expenditures by 40%, and we would have to increase marginal tax rates by 60%. Understand what that means. That means we'd be paying marginal tax rates in the United States in the 90th percent range, and we would be slashing 40%, and only in that could we imagine the fiscal gap closing. That's political nightmare for the United States, right? So as a result, what they're going to try to do is exactly what they are doing, which is paper over the gap, right? Which is what's going on. So I have a paper that was published by the LSE called The Debt Inflation Theory of the Financial Crisis, which is a slightly different take on the debt deflation theory of the crisis, which is associated with Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman. But it's a debt inflation, and it relates to the earlier period where the fiscal imbalance leads to the monetization, which then causes the disturbances, which then eventually lead to the debt problem and then the liquidity problem, okay? So Bernanke, Yellen, and the Fed endgame. So here's one of the things. United States, if you follow, we have in the last 2 decades engaged in a lot of activity where we don't know what the endgame is. So we just jump in, but we have no idea how to exit. I don't want to talk about foreign policy at the moment, but that's exactly what's gone on in our Fed. The Fed decided that the house was on fire. They took the hose, they sprayed it as much as they could to try to put the fire out. And now what's happening is they don't know how to turn the fire off. They're tampering or tapering the hose, but they don't really have it. Now, let me step back for a second, just explain Bernanke. For those of you who are young here, Bernanke's not like the devil incarnate or something like that. He's actually a really good economist who studied the Great Depression and probably studied the Great Depression, besides Milton Friedman, more than any other economist. He has a famous paper from 1983 where he thinks he has identified why the Great Depression happened and why its severity was so great. And the easiest way to say that is he believes that it's the credit transmission mechanism was broken. And the easiest way to understand that in a metaphor is imagine that you're in the upstairs of your house and you go to take a shower and you turn the water on and no water comes out. That's a liquidity crisis. There's no water coming out. And you say, like, what the hell happened in my house? So you go in your basement and you notice that the pipe has been busted. And all the water that you're calling up to come out of your shower is going all over your basement floor. Now, what do? All right? The first thing you have to do is you got to fix the pipe. That was the nationalization of the banks, right? Because if the credit transmission mechanism is broken, the water is always going to just end up on, no matter how much monetary policy you engage in. So fix the pipe and then pump it with what? Water, to get the water pressure up so that it can go back to your shower. That's how to understand what Bernanke was trying to do, and he was a sincere actor in that. The problem is his theory is wrong from our perspective. But it's not that he was, sort of a guy sitting there saying, how can I bankrupt the country and become really rich myself or something like that, which is a lot of politicians. They get busted, like Catherine Legrand right now, right? All of you know this. She was a finance minister in France. Now she's the head of the IMF. She's under charges right now of corruption because, her and Sarkozy were paying off their friends, right, with the thing. So, and she yelled at everyone for supposedly being, greedy. I love it. Anyway. So my favorite observer of politics is not an academic. It's actually H.L. Mencken. And he would have understood this perfectly, but I can't quote Mencken today. I'll do it out in the hallway. Anyway, Bernanke and Yellen and the Fed endgame. So these people are trying to, fuel the economy with cash to defeat the liquidity crisis idea. And they, so Bernanke came up with, quantitative easing and then also Operation Twist. And in doing that, now Yellen has taken over, and she's also committed. She's tapering. She's cutting back, right? But she is committed to the idea that anytime the unemployment rate clicks up, she'll fuel the money again with cash, okay? So here's the problem. Even master jugglers can drop the ball. Right? So rather than like taking on the whole Keynesian apparatus right now, which I am willing to do, and I gave you some suggestions about that with regard to microeconomics, but let's assume that all this juggling is a right way to go. The real problem we have to ask ourselves is when the task is very difficult, even master jugglers might drop the ball. And that's what we've asked Bernanke and now Yellen to be. Master jugglers balancing on a ball, juggling, and they might drop it. And when they drop it, what are the consequences? This is what's wrong with triage economics. We've empowered people in an emergency to take extraordinary measures, violating the basic principles of economics and common sense. And if they fail in their task, the consequence is not that the patient just has lost an arm, it's that the patient stops beating. We need to get back to some common sense wisdom about the way an economy is operated. Bounded by the rule of law, respect for private property, freedom of prices, accurate profit and loss accounting. All right, so is this the end? No, not the end. I'm going to end on a high note here. Because Adam Smith tells us there's lots of ruin in a nation. And again, I don't want to read a whole quote from you here, but I want to sort of stress the following. Okay? The natural effort of every individual to better his own condition, I am going to read the quote, better his own condition when suffered to exert itself with freedom and security is so powerful a principle that it is alone and without any assistance not only capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity, but of surmounting 100 impertinent obstructions with which the folly of human laws too often encumbers its operation. Okay? The folly of human laws too often encumbers its operation. We can overcome that. The counterfactual, all right, is that we are overcoming all of this weighted down view because we have great innovation. So let me just end with a vision here for you. The first thing is I'm going to call these horses Smith for the gains from trade, Schumpeter for the gains from innovation, stupidity for government. Okay? As long as the gains from trade and the gains from innovation continue to outpace the losses that we suffer due to government stupidity, the economy tomorrow will be better than today. The counterfactual is how much better could have we been had we not had the distortions caused by stupidity? And that's the question that we have to sort of come to grips with. Because what we want to do is we want to promote long-term economic growth. And all of our efforts to provide short-term relief undermine our long-term economic growth. And we don't eat growth rates, by the way. So I'm not just, it's not like an obsession with growth. It's what growth purchases for us, which is longer life expectancy, right? Better, more convenient living, all of these kinds of better education, greater access to educational opportunities and whatnot for minorities and for women. All right? Growth buys us all kinds of things that we find desirable for living a flourishing human life. If you kill the goose that lays the golden egg, you cut back the ability of people to live flourishing lives. And what liberty should be about is human flourishing, not equality or anything like that. It's about flourishing, and that's our number one thing that we have to do. And in order to do that, we have to always make sure that Smith and Schumpeter forces are outdistancing the stupidity that seems to be our constant sort of drag on our economy, going all the way back from Adam Smith all the way up to today. So thank you very much.
Muito bem, então vamos iniciar a sessão de perguntas.
Power right here. Did I hit it?
No, it's off.
It's off.
Sorry. It's on.
It's on. Okay. Okay, thanks.
Bom, vamos iniciar então a sessão de perguntas. O professor acha que a resposta que o governo, ou a decisão do governo para poder resolver a crise, mediante o uso de liquidez excessiva, ainda pode trazer um outro choque a curto ou médio prazo?
Yeah, this is, so just, to put things in the American context, I would say that the most dangerous book published this summer was not Thomas Piketty's book on inequality. It's not a big surprise for a French intellectual to complain about inequality. But the more damaging book for people from our side that we have to address is a book by a man named Dan Dresner, who is, broadly speaking, a classical liberal, and he wrote a book called basically that the system worked. And his argument is that we did all the right policy steps to prevent us from going to Armageddon, and that we have to go, that line. And I think we have to address this book because the counterfactual is that we are walking around and the economy isn't a complete basket case, right? But the reality is, I think, is that we also haven't seen the consequences of the massive liquidity that has been thrown into the economy. Part of the reason is that the banks haven't been lending out the money yet. They've been holding on to the money, so there's a tremendous amount of reserves that once they go in, that goes back to the point about the end game. So what is the end game? How does the Fed soak up all this excess reserves? So I used to say to my students that, this is my undergrad students, I'd say I'd pay them $100 if they could draw a really good cartoon of Ben Bernanke in a helicopter dumping cash out of one thing, right? That's Friedman's helicopter, but then having a vacuum cleaner with his foot sucking up the excess reserves. And if we could do that at the same time. This is the dance that we've asked Bernanke to engage in, or now Yellen to engage in, and that's what I mean by the metaphor of the clown on the juggling ball, right? It's asking them to juggle something which a master juggler would have a very difficult time doing, even if that was the right policy. So my own view is that we have basically been seeing a kind of reinflating of the bubble in the United States. This has been captured in the asset prices that have been driven up in the United States, and that there has been technology. Here's something that will prove me wrong. Not really prove me wrong, but would be a countervailing force. Some form of massive nanotechnology that led to a massive increase in our productive capacities. And the Internet 2.0 kind of claim that people are making, right? That will offset these negative consequences, and you'll end up by being able to grow. And I think but my view is, so I can't predict. By the way, I'm not a good investment advisor. I always say I go to cocktail parties with my wife, and people say, oh, you're an economist. And then there's two responses. One is, they look like they just drank sour milk, and they're like, economics like the worst subject they had in college. And I'm like, great. And then the other one is, where are interest rates going? And so now I have a snarky response, which is, if I knew where interest rates were going, I wouldn't be at this party with you. Right? I'd be in Barbados or something, enjoying life, The bottom line is that all I can do is look at the patterns. I can't predict what the offsetting factors are that are going to change. So you could have these things, but right now I would say we're in a very precarious position because we have, in fact, fueled the economy, and we haven't yet seen the corrections fully take place. That was long-winded. I'll try to be shorter. Yeah. Let me get my...
Okay. Como modificar o sistema econômico baseado em dívida e inflação no arranjo democrático atual?
All right, so you guys all understand the question? If I could solve this, I wouldn't be here either. Look, I mean, we have to have a re-examination of what we mean by democracy. So I think Hayek has a very important distinction in the Constitution of Liberty, where he makes a distinction between liberalism and democracy, in which what we need to have is a re-examination of liberalism and then democracy. So we shouldn't have the democratic fetish. Just because we can have illiberal democracies. And so we got to guard against that. Just because something's democratic doesn't mean it's good. And we need to understand. So that goes back to the question that we need to ask about the scale and scope of government. It's not the size of government, it's the scope of government, which means what are the appropriate roles of government in a society. And we have to understand that if we're going to starve the state of responsibility, we have to see the private sector in its nonprofit and for-profit avenues actually fill in the gap. So there has to be ways in which the things that people fear about free societies, people fear freedom. They fear the lack of security. They fear lack of a safety net, all that stuff. We have to show that market mechanisms or voluntary mechanisms can fill in the gap effectively to take care of problems, social problems of poverty, ignorance, and squalor. You can't just say, oh, let it all happen, poverty, ignorance, squalor, who cares? You have to show that the voluntary sector, because if the state's not going to do it, then the private sector in its voluntary or for-profit sector has to fill in the gaps through charity or through other mechanisms of civil society. That's the challenge for young people. Young people have to sort of grab onto that idea and make what a free society looks like. Not a free economy only, but a free society. A free society is a radical vision of a change in which we interact with one another. And in that sense, we treat each other in that world democratically, what's really meant by democracy, which is that we treat each other not as means to an end, but as equals, true equals in an exchange. Now, is that what democracy means today? No. Democracy means today, one man, one vote, right? Majority rule, right? And that is all kinds of problems. That's what leads to that picture of the debt that I showed you up there, which is because I make promises to Peter and rob Paul to pay the promises. All right? And that's just that robbing Peter to pay Paul needs to stop if we're going to somehow get our economic systems under control again. Yeah, keep on forgetting. All right.
No problem.
I've learned Portuguese.
Paul Krugman disse uma vez que não há problema em criar débito público, deve ser, né? Pois, nas palavras do Krugman, nós estamos devendo para nós mesmos. Qual a sua opinião a respeito disso?
Yeah. I actually didn't need to listen because as soon as you said Paul Krugman, I had a response. Not really, but part of the reason why Krugman can make the arguments that he makes is he believes that we live in a world of idle resources, right? And so therefore, there's no cost to the policies mistakes that are going on because we're living in a world of idle resources. That means it's a world of non-scarcity, right? That means that you're not going to have those things. So in a world of an aggregate demand failure, that's actually what the world looks like. So all he cares about is getting the spending going, all right? And then that's going to go. It's also the case that he's going to argue that inflation or monetary policy is not going to be effective because monetary policy is like pushing on a string. So imagine the metaphor of a table here, and I had a shoelace on the table, and I tried to push the string to the end of the table from the back. What would happen to the string? It would ball up and not go anywhere, right? That's what Krugman believes is going on if you just engage in monetary policy. So what you need to do is you need to pull the string from the other end. And that's fiscal policy. So that's why he believes you need to use fiscal policy, not monetary policy. And that's why in 2013, the discussion over austerity was such a critical point that Krugman's unwilling to now fess up to. But the reason why that was a testing point was because he claimed that the cutbacks in government expenditures in the United States would lead to the United States economy collapsing. And it actually turned out not to be the case. Now, I should step back for a second. The debate is wrong because we actually didn't engage in austerity. What we did was we engaged in creative accounting, as you mentioned before, which is that imagine that I'm the Department of Education and I ask for a $100, my budget needs to be $100 better next year. And the government comes back and says, no, we're only going to give you $50 next year. What the people at the government office are going to say is, you slashed my budget by 50%. When in reality, I increased your budget but they're going to claim I smashed it, and so Krugman's going to say, oh, see, that's austerity working, and whatnot. It's really not the case. But Krugman's unwilling to deal with the own claim that he made, and he's trying to run circles, to try to get out of this. But the reality is that he believes that you can do this because we live in an economy that's characterized by idle resources. Therefore, anything that we do to motivate the movement of those idle resources is going to be positive to the economy. As W.H. Hutt wrote a long time ago, sometimes idle resources are idle for a reason. Those are the only idle resources because they actually shouldn't be being used. But the ones that are actually there, we're in a world of scarcity. And by misallocating them in the wrong way, the crowding out effect, we are going to pay a consequence.
Please.
I told you, I know. Go ahead.
Bom, o professor falou durante a palestra que o Ben Bernanke não era um agente do mal, um demônio. Ele apenas seguia as políticas ou o pensamento da escola keynesiana. Então, tanto Bernanke quanto outros banqueiros centrais e teóricos que aceitam ou pertencem à escola keynesiana, qual é o problema deles? É falta de informação ou escolha teórica equivocada?
All right, that's a big question because it has a lot to do with what happened to the transformation of economic education post World War II in America. So I don't have the time to go into the whole thing about that, about how economics changed and the education that was involved. But the bottom line with Bernanke, so some politicians, some appointments are actually a little bit more political, right? I mean, we now know from Arthur Burns' diaries that Nixon, pressured Burns to generate a business cycle, basically by fueling the economy during the election cycle so that Nixon would win. And he accommodated that. So the Fed has a history of accommodating political pressure. That's different from the theoretical argument that I was making. So the point I was just trying to make is that in Bernanke's sense, what you can see is his practice was consistent with his theories. It was a theory-consistent practice, as opposed to, say, Greenspan, whose theories were ones to fight inflation, but yet he was an inflationary Fed chairman. Okay, right? Why did Greenspan do what he did? It's different. So I think as a general rule, by the way, in debate, we should assume the best of intentions on the part of our opponents, even when that might not be true. But we should assume that and then show that on their own terms, they failed to achieve their goals. That's Mises's method, right? That's Mises's method. Rothbard had criticisms of that. I disagree with Rothbard's criticisms as it strictly comes to economics, which Rothbard actually isn't criticizing when it's strictly economics. He's criticizing them for public policy. But I think Mises's argument is the right way to go. You treat ends as given, you limit your analysis to the efficacy of chosen means to those given ends, and you show that your opponent made a mistake on their own terms. That way you have a greater chance of nudging the conversation in direction more towards the position that you hold. That would be my strategy in all intellectual exchanges. Now, do I always agree with that? No, of course. Sometimes, the people that you're talking about are actually really, they are satisfying their needs, which is, I want to maximize my power. Frank Knight had a great line. He said, people say the following thing: I need power to achieve X, Y, and Z. Knight says, I stopped listening after the first three words because those are the only ones I can believe. I need power, right? And so we have to recognize that. But I think that takes us outside the realm of economics and more in political theory and moral theory. I'm coming.
Ok. Há alguma contradição ou um tipo de imoralidade para quem é um estudioso ou está iniciando no estudo da escola austríaca, que essa pessoa trabalhe para o Estado, para o governo, de forma geral?
Oh, okay. So I work at a state university. Okay? when I decided to go to graduate school at George Mason University, which has a very strong connection of market-oriented people, my undergraduate teacher, Hans Senholz, told me that I was going to a state university. Like, he just said that. Like, he says, "You're going to a state university?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "You will become a Keynesian?" And I'm like, "There's no Keynesians there, Dr. Senholz." He says, "You will be a Keynesian." But in the United States, it's important to recognize that the politics of universities are such that almost all universities, except for Grove City College and Hillsdale College, accept some form of federal influence, federal funding. And so all private universities have funding in them. A lot of public universities have private funds in them. It's like mixed hybrid forms. So I don't think that I think our goal is to try to be in the best position that we can be in to leverage our ideas to spread, our ideas throughout the society. I think that's also true for people who care about politics. So I don't think there's anything immoral about going into politics if that's your interest and that's what turns you on. Just like I don't think there's anything wrong going to work for the Fed. What I think is wrong is if you do things that are in violation of what you believe to be true. I think the goal of the economist is simply to speak truth to power. Period. End of story. Never to modify what your message is to be politically popular. The goal of the economist is simply to rain on the parade of the populace, all right, and to pop the popular fallacies. And so if you're an economist working in government and you're actually popping fallacies, I think you're doing, God's work, in quotes, okay? On the other hand, if you're a free market radical who goes and works in government and then the next thing you know, you're advocating rent controls, I think then you've sold out or whatever. It's safe for an academic to say about selling out, but, I think that's what happens, and I think you don't want to be captured. You don't want to be captured by the regulatory apparatus, so we need to work to stop government capture of economists. Let me just give you one story. Ronald Coase, who's actually one of my favorite economists, he wrote a famous paper on about the FCC and allocating the spectrum rights. And just recently I came across a letter that Coase wrote in response to a criticism where someone accuses him of being bought out by the radio interest to argue for auctioning off the spectrum like that, right? And Coase writes this brilliant letter. He's an English gentleman, so he never gets nasty with anyone. And he writes this letter where he says, "Look, I didn't receive a penny from the broadcasting industry." But then he writes a defense of why mercenary scholars would probably outproduce those scholars who believe that they're doing it for the public interest, and that the public interest scholars would actually probably do more damage to society than someone who just says, "I'm in it for the money." And he explains the logic of all of this. And it's a brilliant sort of exposition. So I actually think the goal of economists is simply to speak truth to power, to do economics to the best that you can, and to sort of try to challenge the popular fallacies that are so attractive to politicians.
Muito bem. Bom, nós estouramos o tempo. Eu queria encerrar agradecendo mais uma vez ao professor Boettke pela segunda e excelente palestra. É um privilégio para nós aqui no Brasil tê-lo e poder aprender com a sua inteligência e com a sua comunicação. Muito obrigado.
Thank you.